Hello, can I welcome members, officers and the public watching on the webcast to today's GLA Oversight Committee of the London Assembly. I've called this meeting as urgent business for the reasons set out in the agenda and primarily so we can ask questions of those who've been protecting Londoners. We need to gain an in-depth insight into London's coordinated response of COVID-19, the current and future challenges faced by Londoners, but also to look at the focus of our effectiveness in resilience planning and supporting Londoners adapting to the new challenges that we face. Also alongside this, there will be a number of meetings run by the London Assembly looking into the actions not just of the Mayor but also other stakeholders in their response to COVID-19's pandemic here in London. Can I then, in accordance with the government regulations, we're holding this meeting on a virtual basis with assemblies and guests participating remotely. I'm here in City Hall with a very small team of people and practising social distancing. I will call Assembly members to speak by name during the question answer session and I will introduce each guest as they join. Please can I remind participants to turn off their phones and to put them on silent during this meeting. And can I then, just before I begin some formal announcements of this meeting, say a big thank you to the technical staff here that are supporting me today and the London Assembly, as well as the GLA staff, both here beside me and those that are not participating that have enabled this meeting to take place. So can I now ask the clerk to confirm the names of Assembly members who are virtually present at this meeting and any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. The members that are present during this broadcast are Assembly Member Susan Hall, Assembly Member Jeanette Arnold, Assembly Member Sean Berry, Assembly Member Steve O'Connell, Assembly Member Caroline Pigeon, Assembly Member Keith Prince, Assembly Member Onkar Sahota, Assembly Member Navin Shah, and Assembly Member Peter Whittle. Also attending as part of the meeting is Assembly Member Andrew Dismore, and we've received no apologies for absence.
Thank you very much. If I move on to item 2 on our agenda, declarations of interest, can we note the list of officers held by Assembly members? Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interest on specific items listed on the agenda? I take it there are none, and none have been communicated to me prior to this meeting. I'm now going to move on to item 3, which is our main item of business, and welcome our guests. Unfortunately, our notification for this meeting included a guest of Professor Kevin Fenton from Public Health England, who at very late stages had to submit his apologies. We're looking to reschedule a session with Public Health England as well as NHS London to come and join us to ask some questions from London Assembly members. But we are very fortunate that our other guests have been able to join us today during what is a very busy time for them. So can I welcome Dr. Fiona Twycross, the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience and co-chair of the London Resilience Strategic Coordination Group, along with Eleanor Kelly, Chief Executive of the London Borough of Southwark and co-chair of the Strategic Coordination Group, and John Barradell, Chief Exec of the City of London Corporation and co-chair of the Strategic Coordination Group. At this point, can I just ask whether one of you wants to just give a very brief summary of the work that you've been doing in the initial phase in dealing with the pandemic here in London?
Would it be helpful, Chair, if I went first for this?
Thank you very much, John.
So the Strategic Coordination Group is part of our normal response to incidents within London of various types. These have been used in the past, from flooding through to Croydon, the tragedy of the Croydon tram crash and so on, and Grenfell. And this is a multi-agency organisation that's set up specifically in response to events such as the pandemic. Its purpose is to pull together different London institutions, different London agencies, both across the private and public sector, and to try and make sure that there is a degree of coordination, understanding of risk, and pulling together of activity to try and deal with the various issues and challenges that are presented to us. This was first set up during the course of March, at the request of the Mayor, to pull together London's response to the pandemic, and has developed over time until its current position of around 120 staff working socially distant, some on site, some not on site, in order to pull this work together. And no doubt, Chair, there'll be other questions that you want to go through to talk through what the aims, objectives, and some of the activities are to date.
Thank you. If I may, can I begin with the first question, probably to you, John, but you may wish to offer it to other members of the team. How effective has the coordination between the COVID-19 Strategic Coordination Group, SCG for short, has been overall? And then I think I've got some follow-up questions.
Make sure the technology works. So, Chair, I think overall this, and I said this to your scrutiny committee after Grenfell, this is probably one of the most complicated and complex scenarios I think we've had. This is not following any form of previous type of incident or event in London, and has therefore meant that we've had to develop as we've gone. We've been building, as it were, the car as we've been driving along, if the analogy works, of developing links, developing coordination across different agencies, and using tried and tested methods as well as developing new ones. So I think given the circumstances of government announcements happening on the day that they are announced and giving us limited information in advance of those announcements, given the fact that this is extremely fast moving, I think the degree of coordination between agencies has been very effective. There have been challenges as we've gone along, and no doubt you'll come to some of those, particularly around some of the agencies in direct response mode. But overall, I would say that the coordination and the activity has improved over time and is certainly stronger than it was than at the beginning of the incident or the beginning of the pandemic.
And given the preparation work, if I can describe it as that, it's not been that, but the formation of the London Resilience Forum, the fact that you had an established network, was that of help to you in terms of moving into dealing with this emergency? And then can you just describe also along with some of those structural challenges that you've had to overcome in the last weeks?
I think, as again I said before, a lot of the effectiveness of response in these situations, in my experience, is about personal relationships and understanding organisations and the relative strengths of individuals. What we traditionally do is to go from an as-is position prior to an incident, through the incident, through the coordination and recovery of that, into try and return to some form of normality that was there before. We recover, in other words, to something there before, using existing partners, existing people to do that. This position is somewhat different. We're going from an as-is position through, and we're still, let's remember, in the middle of this, through managing the pandemic, through to something that's yet to be defined. There are lots of phrases being used for this, new normals and so on, but I'd almost describe it as what's next, whatever the condition will be given the circumstances and given what changes here. And I think therefore we've had to develop and use the talent, skills and knowledge of individuals and organisations in ways that weren't planned for before. So when we started at the end of March, the structure of the group, of the Strategic Coordinating Group, focused on creating subgroups under it to try and understand what was going on in London and its likely effects in the future. The first one of those was Funders Voluntary Sector Group, and they pulled together through London Funders the various voluntary sector organisations within the community to understand need and understand channels and understand what was likely to be required in the future. The second group was an information cell led by members from the Greater London Authority, and their role was to provide data and analysis and give us an indication of what was happening on the ground. The third group was a health oversight group that pulled together NHS, Public Health England and local directors of public health again to give an indication of what was going on in terms of the health sector. This was a health-led incident, if I can put it that way, and therefore they were quite key to this. The last group really were the communications subgroup, and they were putting together the messaging that was required, understanding what was coming from central government, Greater London Authority and local government into some form of consistent messaging. And we also had a number of government liaison officers with us as well. They're sent from departments during these kind of incidents where they will provide liaison back into the home departments. So we have had and still have them from MHCLG, Home Office, DWP and so on. And their role is to facilitate and help this. That structure has developed over time. I'm quite happy to go through the detail of that. But where we now have ended up, again with a number of core agencies involved, so Metropolitan Police Service, the Authority, the Greater London Authority itself, Fire Brigade, etc. But the subgroups being very similar now, added to by what we're calling mortality management. This is the group that is overseeing and making sure that there is sufficient capacity and the systems in place to deal with the excess deaths in London. We also have a specific local authority strategic coordination taking place as well. Over the course of the last month and a half to 2 months, there's been a significant increase in the amount of work required from local authorities, shielding vulnerable people as an example. And that's required the local authorities to change some of their working practices, to develop new ones, and to respond to requests and requirements from government and other agencies. So that's a key subgroup now. We also then identified a series of what I'd call strategic risks that we focused the partnership and focused the work on. The first one of those is around care homes and the risk within care homes. These are the current ones. They have developed over time and do change. But the current set around care homes, around mortality, provision of PPE, not surprisingly, longer term looking at physical and mental well-being and the preparation for as lockdown comes off, what the effect would be on London's health and well-being in the round, the economic impact, and finally, actually the structure of lockdown and the exit from lockdown as and when it happens. So the message I think I'm trying to portray there is this is a very developing and has developed as an organisational structure from a very straightforward set of subgroups looking at their technical and expert areas, now to looking at strategic risk for London and trying to identify who would own and who would develop the response to those.
And in dealing with some of those issues, how in your, I mean, when you're, of course, people have been working together, built up relationships, but in some ways, the task of dealing with the pandemic has been emergency services, public and the private sector coming together to work to solve and tackle some of the impact has been going. Are you in a position just to comment about those relationships and how they have grown over the previous weeks in developing a response to the virus?
So I think one of the striking things for me in this, and this is reflecting back, Chair, as you know, from 7/7, Litvinenko, the polonium case through Grenfell to now, is that the private sector did come forward and make some very generous and useful offers of pro bono support to us, which meant we could add capacity as we were going along for some quite expert areas, actually, which we don't normally have in the public sector. And they were able to help develop some key plans and responses that were built in and used as part of it. In terms of the public agencies, I think it's fair to say that clearly health have had a significant amount of work to do, and therefore their capacity sometimes to be able to respond as quickly as some of the other partner agencies would wish has been limited. It is not surprising. And part of the role here has been to build strong relationships with the key leads in health to mitigate some of those information requests and some of those demands being put on the health service at the moment. So relationships are strong. They could always be stronger, I have to say, but they were built, you know, the relationships, the key ones were built up before we entered the pandemic.
And then lastly from me, before I open it up to some other members, I mean, of course, in terms of limited resources that people have been having to work within, I'm always worried about the capacity for people to respond. Has that been an impact in terms of people's services initially as they started to gear up in terms of their response to the pandemic? And in the background of that narrative, have you having to deal with issues coming up from the front line? I'm conscious of a statement that was made by Robert Jenrick that said London boroughs, should not labour under the false impression that all costs incurred during this pandemic will be funded by central government. Given that we're coming to this end of this first phase of dealing with the pandemic and moving on, hopefully after the weekend we'll hear from the Prime Minister in more detail about how we're going to deal with some subsequent phases of it. Have you been picking up now, as we're at the end of this phase, worries and concerns about funding issues and some of those conversations going on between different agencies?
I think it would bluntly be for someone else to comment on the political nature of funding from central government. One of the key things that we always have to do here is make sure that we're tracking the costs and where the costs are occurring and where they're accruing to. And one of the challenges, I have to say, going back to the beginning of your question, is frankly around the need for social distancing and the fact it's impossible to form the team that would normally be able to be formed around. And in fact, today's Assembly scrutiny is a good example of adaptation in a very short period of time, of using technology where possible to get things done. But it undoubtedly impacts on our ability to respond to this, and has undoubtedly also created some bottlenecks in systems and responsiveness in parts of the public sector. As I said, in terms of the funding and the funding from MHCLG and government, that really is a matter for government, not for me. Okay,
thank you. Does Fiona Twycross or Eleanor Kelly wish to add anything to John that he said to us?
Hi, it's Fiona Len. I think on the finance point, I think it's no secret that COVID-19 is having a huge impact on finances, every single level of society. So that goes from individuals, businesses, London local authorities, the GLA, the country, and the global economy. I think at the moment it's probably a little bit too early to tell exactly what that looks like. But I think that conversations are taking place, continuing to take place with government about what that looks like for local authorities and for every different part of the London system. So I think that's something that over coming weeks and months, it'd be useful to come back to. I know from a GLA perspective, David Bellamy and David Galley hope to brief Assembly leaders in a few weeks' time when the picture becomes clearer. But from everything from TfL to the cost up front for councils to loss of income, it's clear that this is going to have an impact going forward. So I think it isn't something that is absolutely clear yet. It is quite clear that the government has been putting large amounts of money into the response, but there does need to be a discussion further down the line, which is already starting, about what this looks like in the future.
Thank you. Eleanor, do you wish to say anything?
I would just add that one of the things I think that we've learned, given that that our approach has been built on existing practices and existing relationships, is that it's very clear not to underestimate people's capacity to change and to change and to adapt. And I would also say that the responses across all of the sectors have not actually been driven by the availability or the perceived promise of availability of funding. People have stepped up to the plate because it's the right thing to do. They've brought innovation, they've brought adaptiveness, and they've brought sort of like genuine sort of like passion across all of the sectors to respond to the benefit of London across the piece. And I think that will continue, but I wouldn't underestimate the issues that will face the individual boroughs in relation to difficult decisions about things that they're not going to be able to turn off in relation to this response as it continues through recovery, and that will lead to some sort of like quite difficult political decisions in relation to things that may well have been previously promised or things that would have been in council plans. I say that from a local authority perspective rather than across the other sectors, but that's almost certainly true in public health and in the NHS too. So those difficult political issues will continue. The final thing that I would say is also not to underestimate individuals' capacity to want things to be normal. And that doesn't mean that it will return to the way things were. We're still in an emergency, we're still in a level 4 national incident, but it feels like the current normal, and therefore people want it to feel as normal as possible. So regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the emergency, they are trying to make it feel as normal as possible, particularly for their communities or for their organisations.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Assembly Member Susan Hall.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, can I start by saying thank you to John, Eleanor and Fiona for the amount of work you're doing, because we do appreciate you're putting a lot of work into this. Our briefing states that there are 4 co-chairs of the Strategic Coordination Group, but the Secretary of State gave John the power to direct all public authorities on response activities for COVID-19. So can you confirm who is actually the main chair and who is doing the majority of the work?
That would be me, I think. And can I comment while you mentioned the letter? The interpretation I've put on the letter is for me fairly straightforward. The normal way that strategic coordinating groups work is that you have partners around a table and you agree a set of activity. You listen to what's being offered, what's being developed, what the key skills, what the key attributes are for the organisations, and they identify their risks to that group. And it's a collective decision as to what's happened. One of the risks with this, I believe, was that there would be a need sometimes to, and it alludes back to the Chair's previous question a little bit, there would be a need sometimes to say to one of the organisations, you really do need to work together to resolve this problem. So the direction in my mind was simply about directing people to work together to solve. Each organisation is a sovereign body. So the local authorities are sovereign within their territory, as are police, as are fire, as are the other utility companies and the other agencies. So my interpretation of it was I was given the ability to direct that co-working, that joint working together. There is provision, not in the letter as far as I read it, for me to direct public services to enforce a local authority to do something that they did not wish to do. That was the interpretation I put onto the word direction. If I needed to, I would need to go back, in my view, and ask for very explicit power under a Coronavirus Act or something like that to direct public services. It was simply to give heft behind the request.
Okay, thanks. Fiona, what is your exact role on the Strategic Coordination Group?
Thank you. Before I say what my role is, I'd just like to say thank you very much to John and indeed to Eleanor. They were appointed originally by the Mayor, and we felt very much that the letter from Robert Jenrick was an endorsement of that decision. And I think we can all agree that they've put a huge amount of effort and resource and personal time into this, so it's hugely appreciated. As Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, I normally chair the London Resilience Forum on behalf of the Mayor and cover that piece of work on behalf of the Mayor and the GLA. So I generally have oversight of London's preparedness for emergencies, including planning ahead to assess potential risks and preparing for the arrangement to respond, recover, and indeed to learn from the emergencies. So before the pandemic sort of was declared a pandemic, the LRF had actually developed a specific COVID-19 response framework that was agreed in February as the LRF observed the emerging crisis around the world. So at that point, sort of early March, I think it was, we did set up a strategic coordination group from the LRF to provide an oversight of the system-wide impacts upon London. And actually very early on, we saw that it was system-wide, which is why John and Ella were brought in rather than it being viewed simply as a health crisis. I'm now, my main role now is as the Mayor's representative on the Strategic Coordination Group, and I've been involved throughout on the response to COVID-19 on behalf of the Mayor and the GLA, alongside London's emergency services, local authorities and the government, to ensure that the plans are in place and that the city can respond as best as possible to both the public health crisis, but also to the plans to recover from the impact it has on the culture and that has been so key to the response as John outlined it. And it is indeed an incredibly complex and complicated piece of work reflecting the nature of the pandemic.
Yeah, I must say, and I must say particularly thank you to you, Fiona. You've been very helpful answering our questions. Has the Mayor been involved in any of these strategic groups? Has he chaired any of them, or does he attend very regularly?
The Mayor gets regular briefings and updates on the work of the Strategic Coordinating Group. It's relatively unusual for politicians to be directly involved in SCGs. The chairing of the London Resilience Forum by myself as Deputy Mayor is unusual. Most areas of the country it's seen as very operational, and I think that reflects the nature of London. So early on, the Mayor had a series of Mayor's advisory groups, and just to sort of set the scene, to sort of see the picture, to sort of identify the key issues. And throughout the crisis, he's had regular briefings both from PHE and the NHS. We had a session quality management, which those leading on that piece of work were involved in, and a whole series of briefings for everything from faith communities through to the voluntary sector and so forth, so that he does a deep dive on a one-to-one basis with organisations to actually assess and keep on top of the situation as it emerges in London.
Okay, I mean, it's such a shame we can't do a deep dive with him because he's not even prepared to give us 30 minutes of his time. And clearly then he is updated regularly from what you're saying, so I can't see why he couldn't actually be bothered to come and talk to the Assembly. Do you think the role played by the Mayor during the crisis has been clearly defined?
Of this nature is as spokesperson for London, and indeed today the principal reason that he is as busy as he is today is because of the point we find ourselves within this crisis, where there's very high level discussions on what the easing of the lockdown looks like. So I think as spokesperson for London, he's clearly played a key role in reassuring Londoners, but reaffirming the very strong stay-at-home messaging that's been going out. And on a regular basis, he and senior members of his team have been liaising with Number 10 directly, whether that's through a COBRA meeting or through a almost daily meeting at some point of the crisis with Number 10, which the Chief of Staff and John Barradell as the chair of the SCG have attended to flag those urgent issues as they've gone through. Okay,
well, I would just like to point out we offered him to come to this meeting, Fiona, at any time to suit him, on any day to suit him. You are there, and you have been working really well. So this isn't a comment about you, but I do think, given he is the Mayor of London, he should have attended. Especially if you're telling me he knows what's going on, because many of us think he doesn't even know what's going on. I'll leave it there, Chair. But thank you, Fiona, and thank you for what you do.
Well, I know he's looking forward very much to the next Mayor's question session, which I understand is on the 21st of May.
I'll bet he is. Thank you.
I think it's fair to say that Assembly members have received a regular briefing from the Mayor, but no doubt that will form a number of questions on the 21st of May. Assembly Member Shah, did you wish to come in on this point, or will you make your point later? Okay, then I'm going to move on then to Assembly Member Keith Prince on question 3. Okay, we seem to have the gremlins. It was almost predictable this would happen.
Sorry, I forgot to turn my mic on. I have my mic on mute, Chair.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, thank you. So this is mainly to Fiona, but be interested in the views of the other panel members as well. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on supply chains and access to essential household items?
So was that a question on supply chains, Keith? Sorry, it was the sound's not great. Okay.
Shall I repeat it?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on supply chains and access to essential household items?
Okay, thank you. I think John can probably, or Eleanor could probably talk best about the shielding scheme, which obviously sort of directly removes people from being able to go and get their own provisions. I think early on we did see stockpiling of normal household items, and we saw a situation that actually reflected what we thought was likely to happen with some of the Brexit work we did. So actually we were able to use some of the work we've done on Brexit. I think that the issue of supply chains isn't one that I've got a huge amount of detail on. John, are you able to come in on this? This is on household items rather than the general PPE, I think.
Household items, only frankly, would be in terms of shielding, and this is for vulnerable people, particularly Assembly members. So the piece here was government sending lists out to local authorities of vulnerable people. The last list arrived yesterday into some local authorities with an updated list, and its provision of food, medicines, and so on to them. Eleanor, I don't know if you want to cover a bit more detail with that. It's being led by a colleague, Ian Davis, a colleague chief executive, who's leading that cell, that work strand, and coordinating that across the local authorities. But Eleanor, I don't know if you want to comment.
I think just to say that the numbers have not been evenly distributed across the boroughs, and therefore the numbers sort of like coming in have formed a challenge across many of the boroughs in relation to responding to the shielding individuals. It was in under the strategic coordination group. It was a strategic risk and remained a priority all the way through from when it was first notified that this would be the approach. I don't think that well, certainly in the SCG, we haven't looked in any granular detail at the requirements of the shielded individuals, but that information does actually sit in each of the community hubs in the contact that the boroughs have made directly with the people whose names and addresses that they have been given. The issue, the most recent arising issue, was actually about liaising directly with community pharmacies and making sure that people had access to their medications, because that did actually sort of like arise as a risk that needed to be particularly tackled, and was actually also sort of like tied into mechanisms within the community pharmacies of their ability to be able to get volunteers to work directly with them, but not in relation to household goods. We are aware, of course, that certain sectors of the retail sector were able to stay open in relation to providing essential items, and some of those essential items would have included household goods that would have been available through various companies, so that the availability of them had not necessarily been compromised. What had been compromised was people's ability to directly access them, and that's where the community hubs and the shielding came in.
If I can add, Keith, on the issue of access to food, the political group around Easter was the shortages that people were experiencing actually through food banks. So those emergency supplies were under a huge amount of pressure. We've now got a situation where each borough has a food hub which is operational, where actually the hubs are processing meals or emergency food parcels to deliver them to vulnerable individuals and households via the distribution centres. But I think that the access to food, as we see whatever shape the predicted recession takes and those impacts on household incomes in London, access to food through food banks is likely to come under pressure, because actually the model of food banks is not designed for this kind of pandemic situation. So it's throwing up a lot of very complex issues within society, but the immediate issues faced by food banks in that week, the run up to Easter, where you had a huge amount of demand, but food banks were finding it difficult to access supplies, has for the moment appeared to be resolved. And actually, I should thank publicly the staff from the political group offices who stepped up and actually sort of helped do a ring round of some of those food banks to make sure that we could match up information with the food banks and make sure that they had the information they needed in order to get vital supplies.
If I could quickly comment, Chair, on that, I think one of the things that's very positive out of this, if there is one, is that all 33 local authority areas in London now have signed up with the voluntary sector food provision, which I think is a significant achievement. Jackie Belton, who's the chief executive down in Bexley, is the lead officer for looking at food as one of our priority areas and core service delivery areas. And she's due actually to report back to us on Monday on the current state of this, and quite happy to give a written update to members after that point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the biggest users historically of food banks, of course, being rough sleepers, and we now know that 90% roughly of rough sleepers are currently housed in hotels or similar accommodation. But what plans does the Mayor have, Fiona, for after the lockdown, after the current agreements come to an end and those hotels want their rooms back?
This is a piece of work that's, as well as working with the GLA housing team, this is a piece of work that's being looked at through the accommodation cell at the SCG. So at the moment, as you'll be aware, we've got over 1,000 rough sleepers who are in safe accommodation secured by the GLA. And the GLA is working closely with government departments to try and make sure that we apply the Mayor's in for good principle, which means that nobody who's been placed in emergency accommodation in response to the COVID-19 crisis is asked to leave that emergency accommodation without an ongoing offer of support to end their rough sleeping. And I think clearly you'll be very mindful of the fact this is a huge challenge in terms of the numbers who are currently in emergency accommodation. And I think we've really welcomed some of the government's moves that will hopefully avoid additional people becoming homeless through things like the 3-month mortgage repayment holiday and the ban on evictions, but that not to underestimate the challenge. And I'm sure my colleague Tom Copley would be happy to come along and talk to Assembly members about that as it emerges. And indeed, we can make sure that you get a briefing specifically on this. But it is something that people are working very hard to try and avoid this happening. But very mindful of the fact that it's a big challenge, as indeed the government has recognised by their appointment of Louise Casey to look at this area.
Yeah. Can I say, Fiona, I work pan-London in relation to homelessness and provision of accommodation for homeless people. And I would very much welcome a meeting with yourself and Tom, or whoever else you think, because I've got an organisation that's coming up with some very innovative ideas on how we can provide quick accommodation for people.
Why don't we set something up next week? My office will be in touch with your office and we can try and sort something out so we can pick that up at an early stage. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you.
If we can move on, I need to move on, and we'll come back to Assembly Member Prince in a minute. If I can move on to Assembly Member Jeanette Arnold, just to further go into some of the issues around food. I'm conscious, John, Eleanor, you need to leave at some stage to go back onto the job. I understand Fiona is willing to stay on. So we're very grateful. So can I bring in Jeanette Arnold to pose a couple of questions around some of the issues around food and issues relating to that? Jeanette. Is Jeanette Arnold there? Then I'm going to go back to...
I'm here, Chair.
Thank you very much. Do you want to pose your question?
Sorry, I had to unmute the mic. Can I start by thanking the three wonderful people we have with us today for all the work that they're doing at the SCG. If you like, let me be bold and get focused on, it seems to me, the communities that so much has been written about, and that's rightly so because of the mortality rate that's impacting on them, and that's London's Black and Asian and members of minority ethnic communities. And I just read this morning that the Office of National Statistics said a substantial part of the difference in COVID-19 mortality between ethnic groups is explained by the different circumstances in which members of those groups are known to live, such as areas with socio-economic deprivation. So my question is, have you made any assessment, and are you focusing much of your work in these areas where there is known disadvantage so that members of these communities can have access to food? John, can you start?
Sorry, Jeanette, yes. I think there are two parts, I think, to that question. The first one in terms of mortality rates. It's very clear from the data provided by Public Health England that there are 3 boroughs that are significantly above the national average. And again, there is a very clear announcement this morning by Public Health England, by the Office of National Statistics, some very clear data and some very clear evidence around disproportionality in effect and morbidity, death basically, from COVID. And the scientific cell, which is led by Kevin Fenton from PHE, is providing advice and guidance around this, and that is, we can provide that data, I think, to you, and that's one, Fiona, I think you probably want to take away. There's been some briefing on that, Jeanette. In terms of food, again, what I'd say is that this was very early identified as being a potential problem, and the food cell, this group of people, predominantly around voluntary sector, along with business and the GLA, was pulled together to start to address food poverty, likely where we hadn't got the infrastructure in place in some of the boroughs to support food banks. And there was early indications from some food banks that they were not getting donations required. So the boroughs did step up, as said before, with food hubs, particularly around Newham, Brent areas, for an example, to do that. And I think that has proven itself to be of great value. The piece here for me will be what the local authorities then do subsequent to this, to be able to maintain that support into the future. And that is something we will be taking on.
Yes, now we know that London has one of the most mobile communities. If you look at children's school places, you'll see that Londoners has a huge wave of people who move around. How are you working with local authorities to capture these people who I can say could well be on the margins? So they're on the move and in a desperate situation. How are you attempting and to relate to them, and who are you working with?
So part of the role in terms of the strategic coordinating group is to encourage the working across organisations around particular areas, particular issues. So the local authorities themselves, and the local authority lead would be Martin Eastham for this, would be pulling together their responses to vulnerable people within communities, particularly. If it becomes a strategic risk, for an example, or something that they wish to raise with a strategic coordinating group, the route would be for them to raise it through, identify it to partner agencies, and then take that on. That has yet to be raised as a specific issue to the SCG by the local authorities, I have to say.
Yes, I mean, finally, can I just say, I just think that that's such an important group because just in terms of accessing them or getting access to testing for them and actually food, because without food, then, you know, the body has no response to fight off any infection, never mind the coronavirus.
Can I add on that, Jeanette? Obviously, this is something that the Mayor's been raising for some time, and I think it's one of the really strong reminders that actually COVID-19 isn't affecting the whole community equally, that there is disproportionality that can't simply be explained by socioeconomic reasons, and actually at the heart of everything that the response relates to is about keeping as many people safe from this illness as possible. So I think that it would be worth members talking to Kevin Fenton about the work he's doing both through STAC but through Public Health England on this, but also just to reassure people that as well as the public statements the Mayor's been making, Debbie Weeks-Bernard has been starting to pick this up with Nick Bowes at City Hall about looking at what work the GLA can do in this area. So we can try and link you up with them. I know you know Debbie quite well, so I think it would be worth you talking to Debbie about what the GLA is planning to do in this area as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, can we go back to Assembly Member Prince for a final question on this section? Assembly Member Prince, you need to unmute your mic.
I'm unmuted, right. Is that okay, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
Thank you. I think the question's actually been answered in so far as what can the Mayor do to improve the supply chain resilience. I think we've heard very strong answers around the hubs that have been set up in the boroughs. And I know that in Havering, for instance, we did have some issues with the food banks, but the hub was able to top up the food bank. Can I just ask though, going forward, I mean, how we've got some people who are going to have to remain isolated for a long, long period, the very old people, the very vulnerable people. Are there any additional systems or processes that are going to be put in place for those people?
I think that really is part of the challenge we've got in terms of what next, if I can put it that way. The government shielding programme is intended to continue for quite some time. One of the avenues we've been exploring is with David Farnsworth, who's leading the voluntary and community sector group, the forum, as it were, one of those working groups under the SCG, to look at how the voluntary sector could assist with this as well as local government. It does go to the question of what follows where we currently are. We're in, as I think the Deputy Mayor said, a response mode at the moment. We do need to move to something more sustainable, bluntly. 53 days working is probably too much for me. I'm now getting bags under my eyes. So there needs to be something that follows this, and setting that up would need to address exactly these much longer term issues for those who are still vulnerable.
But I think that is the question, John. We obviously we were all caught flat by this, and we've been very reactive. But it is you're quite right. It is now time to be proactive. And what I think the Assembly and the people of London want to know is what plans do you have? What are you putting in place? Or if you haven't anything in place, who's leading the charge on what we think we should be putting in place? And when are we going to hear more about it?
I'm not sure, to be honest, it's within the remit of what I'm doing to answer the question, if I'm brutally honest with you. This is coordinating, as it were, the agencies. It's clearly an issue. It's been addressed. It's been identified and commenced to be addressed in terms of the response phase. It is one of the strategic risks we have identified in terms of the longer term impact, and it's currently being worked. And again, we can give details. Fiona, I don't know if you want to pick this up as part of the move to recovery work that's taking place.
Yes, let's talk about recovery now, Len, or have you got other questions?
I think there are further questions later on about recovery, but I think a lot will flow from when the Prime Minister makes his statement on Sunday about what new normal looks like. And I think there would be an expectation that some of these issues that we're talking about would be picked up and either carried forward and improved upon, if possible, depending on what circumstances we find ourselves in the various next phases. Can I now move on to Assembly Member Berry, who's got a question?
Yes, just you touched on some of the issues, John, already, but I just wanted to go back to when we previously discussed the Grenfell disaster with you and some of the issues there were there about councils who needed help not triggering requests for mutual aid. I think you've hinted today that there are differences in the burdens on different councils, and I just wanted to check with you whether there's been improvement since we wrote the conclusions we sent to the Grenfell inquiry based on your evidence and discussion with the boroughs. Have there been improvements in councils asking for help when they need it and making clear to each other their own needs?
I think they have, actually. What they've done is organise themselves in a way that I think is helpful with this in terms of identifying sub-regions of local authorities, identifying one chief executive to chair that sub-region to pull together their issues. One of our challenges a little bit goes right back to the first question from the chair, is Eleanor and my role in this is not as their peers, but as, if you like, sitting separately doing a different role. And I think sometimes there's been a lack of understanding of that within the system, that our role is different. However, in terms of local government's response to this, I think the coordination they've done in the sub-regions is extremely good. I think from what I've seen that the work that individual officers and their leadership teams, both political and members-led as well as officers, has been extremely good in the boroughs and has undoubtedly made it a lot easier in terms of how London functions and its continuity than otherwise would have been the case. So I do think lessons were learned. I do think the degree of cooperation has been very strong across the boroughs, and offering mutual aid in an unofficial way across the boroughs, I think, is very strong and is certainly part of the lessons learned from the past.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I'm now moving on to Assembly Member Pidgeon to look around some aspects of the lockdown.
Lovely, thank you very much, Chair. And can I put on record my thanks to Fiona, Eleanor and John for the work they've done and the regular briefings we've had as Assembly members from them. I'd like to ask you, what options is the SCG considering for a phased approach out of lockdown? And how might London's approach potentially be differ from other parts of the country, particularly because we've been ahead of the curve in this?
Okay, so if I can first of all say I have no knowledge whatsoever of what is likely or unlikely to be announced in Sunday, January, February, March, or anything else. However, the approach that we've taken is to be a little bit on the front foot if we can. So we know, for an example, the dependency on public transport in London in terms of work, in terms of moving around the city, is far in advance and well ahead of any other city in the country. So London's dependence as a city on public transport is far higher. So public transport becomes the unlocking item, as it were, of any kind of sense of return. The second issue clearly is around schools and opening of schools, and then releasing the workforce, people at work, people at home, carers and so on, back onto London. So what we've done is identify through the leadership of the Met Police a set of workshops that have taken place with the partner agencies underneath the SCG to work through what scenarios would start to look like should those be measures that government choose to take, and what would be the likely impact as best professional judgment at this stage, that what those would be. And those have been fed back to government to give an indication of what would the impact should they choose those things. And I have to say these are ones we made up rather than ones we were told, be really clear about that. This is what would happen. So we have fed that back, and that's probably as far, frankly, as we could go without being told what the release of lockdown is likely to be.
No, completely understand that, and your points about transport being so important in London. Just on that, as lockdown is lifted in or whatever where it is, there's lots of discussion about sort of staggering start times for people and finish times. But what about managing the actual stations? Because that we've seen was an issue early on. Had has some of your scenario planning work looked at how you're going to manage people at stations so that they can social distance?
Fiona, I don't know if you want to pick that up in terms of the TfL side. And Chair, I'm going to have to sadly leave you because I have another thing I have to do. Apologies.
No, thank you, John. And I think Eleanor has to leave us if she hasn't already. But thank you very much for your work that you're doing on behalf of Londoners and your colleagues who are not on this call throughout London working in those key services. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Thank you.
Fiona, over to you.
On the issue of transport, John's right. This has come through all the work on thinking about what release of lockdown might mean. And I think I would repeat John's point that actually this is a decision for government, and we don't have any clear view, probably beyond that which is in the media in terms of ideas that are being floated in the media about exactly what might be announced on Sunday, although we've probably all got our own personal pet things that we would like to see, but I won't go through my personal list of that. But I think that in terms of TfL, clearly they have been very much at the heart of discussions around what easing of lockdown means in London. John referred to the huge number of people in London who are reliant on public transport to get to work compared to other parts of the country. So this is a particular issue for London. So it's not that London would have different rules to other parts of the country, but I think there's different pressures on our system perhaps. So planning's underway, both in terms of discussions with the government from TfL and with the trade unions. Nothing's off the table yet, but I think until we see where the government is going with the easing of lockdown, which I think everybody's agreed is likely to be quite modest in the first instance for very good reasons, these are issues that are all being worked through, and I think we'll see announcements on these as the decisions from government level, which the SCG and the Mayor and the GLA and TfL are feeding into. We'll see announcements of what that means in practice going forward. But I think that nothing's off the table. We do need the public transport system to be up and running. You'll have seen a lot of the announcements around the street space scheme, sort of looking at how more people can walk and cycle to work to sort of relieve some of that pressure. And I think that we have to innovate in order to get London moving again. But I think at the heart of anything that is announced will be public safety.
Lovely, thank you. I think management of stations, people going in, will be really important as part of that. Thank you very much.
Okay, I've got Onka Sahota and Susan Hall would like to come in on this point. Is that still the case?
Chair, I think most of the answers have been covered. I don't need to come in on this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Hall.
Okay, thanks very much. Just a few, if I may. I mean, how we come out of this is so important, given it's London, the capital. What discussions have taken place regarding the impact of the pandemic on not just the budgets of the functional bodies, but on the core GLA mayoral budget?
I referred to this earlier in the context of the fact that COVID-19 is clearly having a massive impact on finances across the piece. So everything from individual through to the functional bodies and to the GLA. So the committee will be profoundly aware of the loss of revenue as currently being discussed with the government. And as you'll be aware, the GLA group receives income from council tax, business rates, and so there is likely to be an impact. The GLA finance team is working closely with London boroughs to understand potential impacts, which may actually be hugely significant for boroughs as well, and being highlighted to government both from a GLA perspective, but also from the functional bodies and through the boroughs. As you'll understand, this is a really complex piece of work with many moving parts, and I think the picture isn't entirely clear. I mentioned earlier that David Bellamy and David Galley are working on this very closely and are hoping to be able to brief leaders of the assembly groups in a few weeks' time as to what the impact might be on the GLA group and the GLA itself as the position becomes clearer.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. How, in your view or from your briefings, has crime changed during the pandemic? Have criminals exploited the pandemic in cases such as targeting closed business premises, using face masks to conceal their identities when committing crimes? Have we seen much of that?
I think overall crime has fallen. There have been instances of things like fraud rising and so forth. I haven't personally heard of any instances where face coverings have been used to sort of target people particularly, but we can find out whether that is the case and we can get details of that to you. But overall, one of the positive things has been that actually the Met's seen a fall in crime during this period.
Okay, do you know how many police officers have been off work with suspected symptoms? Because we know how very high cases of sicknesses are in TfL. Do you have any figures around how this is affecting our police force?
I do, but for a moment, let me just turn to the right page. So at the moment, very sadly, a member of the Met staff died from the illness. And I think it's important to remember that actually sort of the people being off sick has translated in very tragic instances to people losing their lives. So on average, the MPS have said that the current daily average through sickness and self-isolation is just over 10%, so 10.7%. And actually that's much more positive than early projections were around sort of thinking that it might be at 30% abstraction levels through sickness and self-isolation. So that has been a better picture than people had planned for, which has been very positive.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I'm going to ask members to pick up the pace slightly. I've got Navin Shah coming around transport services. Navin?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I have a couple of questions on transport. One is to do with resources, and the other one is to do with ramping up of transport service itself. On resources, London's transport service is currently operating at approximately 10 to 15% of its capacity. This means major loss of revenue. Do you know, Fiona, whether the government has stepped in with emergency funding support for the service?
Discussions are going on probably as we speak around the financial issues TfL is facing with the government. We know that other parts of the country have seen the government step in to help meet the shortfall, so we're hopeful this will be the case in London.
Well, let's hope it happens sooner than later, because we are facing a very, very serious situation as far as resources are concerned on transport-related activities. Moving on to the level of service, whilst we know that the Prime Minister will be setting out a roadmap on Sunday as to where we go from here, but to a question on public transport at the Prime Minister's question time, he referred to bigger and more expansive transport service. So it is envisaged that there will be a need to run more public transport services in order to maintain service levels. Now, question is this feasible, particularly given the concerns about social distancing? Because already the Deputy Mayor has clearly indicated on transport that maintaining 2-meter distance, a coach, underground coach may not be able to contain more than about 26 passengers. Even if it is reduced to 1 meter, we are looking at some substantial changes. So the question is about feasibility. How do we manage? Are you aware of what is being done on that?
There's a huge amount of work being done on that. I mentioned the street space programme that will be key to making sure that as many people as possible cycle and walk to work if possible. One of the big issues that we are going to have to address though is, I can see from the images, most of you are actually working from home. And in London, a reasonably large portion of the population, the working population, has been working from home and will have to probably continue to work from home for some time. So part of the solution to the social distancing issues on transport will have to be about those people who can continuing to not use public transport where possible, and those who can use another form of sustainable transport shifting to that, so the walking and the cycling and so forth. But it is a challenge, and I think as we see the announcements coming through from government, this is going to be a key thing in terms of how London gets back to work and London sort of recovers and moves out of the current lockdown phase. Will be making sure that we do manage people getting back onto public transport in a way that is as socially distanced as possible, but also sort of reflects the need for people to actually change their working practices and ways of commuting where they do have to commute as far as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Let's move on then to the next question from there were members who wanted to come in on this question. Can I assume that you don't wish to pursue that and I can move on to the next question? Thank you. I'm now moving on to Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you, Chair. Another question about workplaces and things that might reopen, essentially. First of all, I wanted to ask, I know on a couple of occasions, both you and John Barradell have said you have no idea what's going to be announced. And I know that you can't tell us in advance what's going to be announced. But just to get some reassurance, there's a leaked plan that's in the Mirror today that talks about reopening the exercise plan at the from Monday, but then talks about schools and markets and garden centres and cafes and things of which we have a lot in London. And there's no mention there of, for example, offices. And I think offices, I might have a further question about that in a second, but offices are certainly a very high proportion of our most concentrated workplaces. There's no mention of that in there. And you would hope that shops, cafes, for that, the government would have been talking both to the mayor about this plan that's been leaked, but also to unions. So I wanted to ask, do you know what's gone into the formation of that plan? And is the plan that's in the Mirror today something that the mayor has checked off on, or is that some sort of early draft that you'll be looking at today?
I would have to check what's in the Mirror today. Apologies, I haven't read that. I know that the government were working on guidance for businesses in terms of reopening that related very much to how you could socially distance within an office space. In the short term, though, the best way to make sure that people who would normally work in an office environment can socially distance is actually to sort of continue to do what most people have where possible, which is to work from home. And I think that obviously the GLA's done this, a whole load of organisations have done it, sort of from everything from banks through to sort of smaller office locations. It's possibly not something that people are going to necessarily want to do indefinitely, but in the short term, people continue to work from home where possible will have to be a part of the solution until a vaccine is found.
Yeah, and
we have no idea, just to reassure you, we have absolutely no idea what is likely to be. We're basing quite a lot of our assumptions on other leaked or floated ideas in the media. So we don't actually, although we've been inputting into government about what we think the impacts of different measures would be, We haven't been part of the discussion in terms of seeing draft documents that might be produced later over the weekend.
Okay, I mean, this worries me because we are a place where a lot of people come to in the course of the day. I mentioned before that we've got a lot of offices. As far as I can tell from the most recent Travel in London report, there's about 500,000 people who come into our central activity zone. Presumably that also includes Canary Wharf, using rail services. These aren't people who can cycle their journeys. These are longer distance commuters. And although they might be taking a health and safety at work approach to whether or not certain kinds of workplaces can reopen, from a London strategic point of view, if we have 1 million of those workplaces in the middle of our city, the transport question then becomes much more serious than whether or not you can distance when you get to work. Are we having the right influence on the government's thinking, do you think? Have we got the right access as a city?
Well, I think the government's been given all the documents that the Strategic Coordination Group has produced in relation to what the impact of various lockdown easing would have. So I think that we have had the input. We have forwarded documents. There's been those high-level conversations that I've mentioned between John Barradell, David Bellamy as the Mayor's Chief of Staff, and Number 10 and other government departments have also had we've had input into. What I would say is that your example of Canary Wharf is probably a very good example of where people can continue to work from home quite successfully for some time, because of the nature of the office environment. And actually the city and Canary Wharf, if you look at the footfall and the patterns of commuting very early on, they were among the first places to have very low footfall. So I think at one stage, I might be wrong, and I'll correct myself afterwards if I am. At a very early stage, there was about 1% of normal footfall in the City of London. It was definitely between 1 and 5% anyway. It was really low because actually a lot of the professions that are carried on in some of these environments can be successfully carried out through use of technology, through home working. And actually, so a reasonably high proportion of those people who have been travelling in quite long distances have actually been in those professions which are most easily transferable to home working.
Great. So just to clarify, and finally, you're fairly confident that for the office workers, the commuters who come into the centre of the city, not only the advice from the Mayor, but the advice from the government will be work at home for the foreseeable future?
Without knowing what is in those documents, I can't see a situation in which that isn't a strong message from government at the weekend.
Okay, thank you.
Fiona, I know you're conscious of your time constraints. We've got 4 more questions. If members can be fairly brisk in those, I wonder if we can get through those. I'm now going to call on Assembly Member, 5 more questions. Assembly Member Whittle.
Hello, Fiona. Hi. I just have one question. You sort of covered a lot of it, actually, but what do you think are the sort of general challenges London faces in trying to maintain whatever that social distancing rule happens to be when we know from Sunday, as it were? I mean, what do you think are the factors that London particularly has, the challenges it's going to face? I mean, you just mentioned there about a vaccine. Well, we're talking about a year, I think, for that. So what do you see going forward?
I think the biggest challenge is the one that I think both John and I mentioned previously, which is the high level of people who normally habitually sort of travel by public transport. The movement of children to schools by public transport is also sort of higher than other areas. So that those are issues. What I would say is, though, that while we've seen some instances of people breaking the sort of social distancing rules around lockdown, we've had a huge level of compliance from Londoners on this. There's been well under 1,000 fines imposed for what is a huge population, and I think that as long as the government tells a story to the public and we continue to reinforce that, as to why social distancing needs to be maintained and reinforced over coming weeks and months, actually Londoners have been incredibly compliant, much more so than I think people envisaged when the measures were first introduced. And there's no reason, as long as there's a good reason why people should continue to do so, why this won't continue to be the case.
Thank you. Can I just come up back on one thing? Assembly Member Barry there was talking about office workers quite rightly. My concern is that, you know, what about, it's all about a lot of people who are office workers, a lot of professional people happily can adapt to being at home, and it's all very well, but they are a particular section of society, and the fact is that there are millions of people who actually work in things like retail and whatever, and work in hospitality. You know, they cannot work at home. How will social distancing affect them?
I think this is one of the massive dilemmas that we've got as a society, both here in London and wider. I know that the question about sort of wearing face coverings has been quite hotly contended, but one of the reasons why the Mayor's been suggesting that people should wear face coverings where social distancing isn't as easy or as possible as it might be in other contexts is that not that it protects the person who's wearing the face covering, but actually it protects the people who are in your vicinity if you are ill. So I think just as people have been very compliant with social distancing, if the evidence is such that actually people are asked to wear face coverings to protect those people who they don't know who are standing alongside them, who may be those frontline workers, the nurses, the doctors, the physios, the ambulance drivers and so forth, who we need to sort of continue the response effort, I think people will be very open to wearing face coverings, and actually a lot of people already are. So I haven't travelled on the tube recently, but I know from colleagues who have that actually a very high proportion of people who are travelling on public transport currently already are wearing face coverings of some sort. And it seems a very small ask if it is protecting people who are travelling in the same carriage as you and you're not aware, you're asymptomatic. I mean, obviously, if you've got symptoms, you shouldn't be travelling. But actually, there are things like that that could potentially make a difference, not necessarily to the person who's wearing it, but to those people around. And I think that given the high level of compliance and willingness the public has had to protect other people, to protect the NHS by staying at home, which I think 2 or 3 months ago, we wouldn't have imagined that people would have been as compliant as they are. I think people will be willing to consider things that they might not have imagined we would do as a society in very recent weeks in order to protect other people.
I see. Okay. I think I should leave it there because we haven't got much time. Is that right?
Thank you. Yes, if you can. I mean, we will be able to follow up these issues, I think, because the challenges will continue into the next phase as well, and we'll return to those. Question 11, Onka Sahuta. Could you...
Great. Fiona, thank you very much for all the hard work you're doing and for the Mayor, what he's doing in giving leadership to London. My question is about the BME community, and of course, it's already been alluded to that the BME community is being affected disproportionately. And of course, I should put on the record of the tremendous contribution of the BME community in the NHS, and the soldiers who have been fighting this war have been the NHS, and when the history will be written, it'll be the NHS who will stand up as the heroes of this fight. And of course, we know that only a few days ago, when I looked at the figures, 119 people who work for the NHS member staff died, 119 of them, of which 64 were from the BME community. And of those 64, 53 were born outside the United Kingdom. So these are the people who came to this country to work for the NHS and have now given their lives in the defence of Londoners and people in this country. So I think I want to put this on record of the tremendous contribution of the NHS and also of the BME community in particular. As Assembly Member Arnold was alluded to earlier on today, the Office of National Statistics said that the BME community is so the black and Afro-Caribbeans are more than 4 times likely to be suffering as a consequence of COVID-19. But of course, what this pandemic has shown, right, it has been the impact of social deprivation and social disadvantages and the inequalities in health. And this, of course, will be a big issue for London, right? What have you done, and what has the Mayor done to investigate this matter further?
The Mayor's been at the forefront of calls for the disproportionality to be looked at and taken seriously. I think early on in the pandemic, there was very much a sense that people were saying, we're all in it together. Quite clearly, the disproportionality says that some people are more in it than others, and this has to be a concern for us all. I think, as I mentioned to Assembly Member Arnold, Debbie Weeks-Bernard's been leading some work on this for the Mayor. Kevin Fenton, who, as well as being the Regional Director of PHE, is the Mayor's formal public health advisor, is picking this up both for the SCG and will be doing work on this, no doubt, for the Mayor. But it continues to be something that is at the forefront of what the Mayor's been calling for, and will be a key piece of work for the GLA through Debbie Weeks-Bernard and through PHE Kevin Fenton. And I suggest that actually an early meeting either of this committee or the Health Committee speak to Kevin Fenton to discuss the work he's undertaken in this area. As you rightly point out, this is disproportionality that we can't just skim over, and we do owe a huge amount of gratitude to those health workers who are sort of out there, sort of on the front line, and it is absolutely tragic that so many people have died as a result of being there in the front line. So I think that this is something that we have to take seriously as a city. The Mayor has been calling for this for some time, and as well as linking Debbie Weeks-Bernard up with Jeanette, I'll make sure that she speaks to you at an early stage as well.
Okay. I just want to put on the agenda that it may be worthwhile for the Mayor in the months to come to set up a special review of what's happened in London, maybe commission some report on it particularly. But also, has the Mayor made any representations to the government on the terms of reference of the inquiry which the government is holding?
I think that the government inquiry on the
impact
on disproportionality
on the community. The government is holding an inquiry on the.
Yeah, no, I understand that he has written to the government on this. So I can get you the.
Well, I'm just wondering whether the Mayor had made any in terms of reference.
I have got that letter.
Yes.
Sorry, you broke up just at the end of that, Anka. Can you just repeat the end of that?
I was suggesting that I wonder whether the government has asked the Mayor to comment on the terms of reference, or has the Mayor made any representations of what he thinks should be covered in terms of reference of that inquiry, which the government is setting up?
The Mayor's definitely written to the government about this issue. I'm not aware that the government has asked the Mayor to comment directly on the terms of reference, but that's something that my colleague Debbie Weeks-Bernard would be able to enlighten you on. And Kevin Fenton has been very much involved in this work, and there is a paper that went to the SCG on this, which we can also ask if we can forward to members of this committee.
That would be very helpful, Fiona. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I bring in Assembly Member Pidgeon?
Thank you. Just quickly following up on this point about a review, clearly there have been a number of transport workers, particularly bus drivers I'm thinking of at this point, who have died. And I'm wondering whether the Mayor with TfL and bus companies, who have a big role to play here, are doing anything to review the working conditions, the environment on and off buses, to see what more can be done to protect bus drivers, because this isn't going to stop overnight. This is going to be something we're going to be living with for some time.
Yes, I think there's been the work on bus drivers in relation to the entry at the middle or the back part of the bus. we would take the view that the face coverings is also partly to protect the transport workers as well as other passengers. You rightly point out that there's been a number of tragic deaths of public transport workers, and this is clearly a huge issue of concern, and TfL is working closely with the government but also with the transport unions to look at what can happen going forward to make sure that these transport workers who are on the front line, but as we've identified, hugely important to London getting back to whatever the new normal looks like, protected as far as possible.
Okay, very quickly, Assembly Member Arnold. Okay, I'm going to move on.
I'm
very
coming
quickly.
in. It takes a while to unmute your mic. Sorry about this. Can I just say I agree with everything that my colleague, Assembly Member Sahota has said, and I thank Fiona for her responses. But I do just want to widen this out in terms of deprivation and say, you know, that there's one hand that every death from coronavirus is a tragedy, and that behind every statistic there is a family that will never be the same again. But let's not forget that it's having a disproportionate impact on men. So we need to understand that. It's having an impact, definitely having an impact on elders and obese individuals. And so I think what I've heard Fiona say is that really when we get Professor Fenton in front of us in his role as Regional Director of Public Health at Public Health England and NHS London, because he has convened a group, including former Assembly Member Trevor Phillips, OBE, that we have alongside him the Deputy Mayor, because part of her long title is about social inclusion, and that would include issues of deprivation. So I think that we need quite a bit of time when we meet these people, because this is such an important issue.
I think it's a very important point.
Thank you.
Very important point you made there. We'll look at that when we invite them in the future. I need to move on. I've got 3 more members. Very quickly, quick fire questions, I think, on these ones. Assembly Member Dismore.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I want to come in on PPE. Fiona, are you happy that frontline workers now have access to sufficient quality and quantity of PPE? Because we get these conflicting stories. The government says there's plenty of PPE going round. We know, for example, the fire brigade has set up the distribution network for local authorities. But you see these stories all the time, particularly in care homes, of care workers saying they just don't have enough of the right equipment. And that may well be behind this upsurge of serious cases in the care homes, which is where the big problem now seems to be.
PPE has been a perennial issue that has been raised on pretty much every meeting of the strategic coordination group I've been on. I think that at the moment, as we see the current wave sort of start to tail off, it doesn't appear to be such a problem. It would be absolutely scandalous if we entered a second wave or even a third wave and the first wave haven't been addressed. And I think that that's really where the strategic coordination group is now. We've seen people at times be very close to running out of PPE. Part of the mutual aid that was discussed earlier has been sort of mutual aid around sort of people redistributing very scarce supplies of PPE. And I think what we need to make sure is that going forward, that is addressed, particularly if, as we see lockdown easing, new guidance has additional burdens on the PPE supply chains to enable people to get back to work. So I think it hasn't been perfect. I think it's been pretty close to the opposite of perfect at some points. This is an issue that I think that the SCG is clear needs to be addressed. The Mayor's written to government on a number of occasions about this, and it has to be something that's got right for the sort of future pattern of this disease going forward. Just to reassure colleagues from the Assembly that the London Resilience Forum is going to an interim review at its meeting in June, just to look at what we've learned from the first wave, so that we can address issues from the point of view of London resilience, but also can feed back to government issues we feel that they need to be on top of. But this is an issue that's been raised throughout the crisis and actually has to be got right for future waves.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, obviously, we've got to make sure that the kit is good for fit for purpose. We saw this story today that the much trumpeted 400,000 gowns from Turkey are substandard. Yeah. So we paid for something that, again, which is of no use, like we did the tests from China. But London's pandemic strategy noted that central government maintained appropriate quantities of PPE. That's obviously before the event. So are you going to be lobbying the government to stress test their stocks and supply chains more rigorously for the future, both in terms of quantity and quality, so we don't get these perennial stories of people having to do their job unprotected and exposing themselves to the risk? And we see how many people have died as a result.
The Mayor's already been lobbying very hard on PPE as we've gone through the crisis, and I can't see that this is going to be a demand that goes away. We have to make sure people are protected in doing their jobs.
Okay, thank you.
Assembly Member O'Connell. Assembly Member O'Connell.
I am here. I'm sorry, Chair. And Fiona, thank you very much for what you're doing and your support. My questions largely have been asked and answered, so I'll be quite brief. But following on from Andrew Dismore, this is the issue about the face coverings, and there seems to be mixed messages coming out from government. This probably is a better question for PAG and from the Mayor. The Mayor seems to be having one view that may be contrary to government. Could you just simply give the present position around face coverings that is held by the Mayor and yourself, please?
I think that this is about actually looking at things as a bit to having face coverings. Yeah. I personally don't see why we wouldn't go down that route. My mum's actually made me some face coverings in advance of sort of changes to easing of lockdown. So I think that this is something that I think people would be willing to do. We've already seen people willing to curtail their freedom to have the lockdown. So and we've seen that as other countries in other Europe and around the world have eased lockdown, face coverings or face masks have been introduced, not for the own personal protection, but for the protection of others. The Prime Minister has actually indicated that he thinks it's likely that we'd go to a situation in which face coverings would be considered. I think the government, as we would in London, needs to consider every single option, and we can make provision for when people have as strong social distancing as the 2 metres that people have been advised to have currently. If face coverings is part of that solution, then I think we would support that.
Okay, thanks. I mean, just thank you on that. I mean, more will be revealed at the weekend, so there may be some more guidance there. Thank you very much, Chair. Fiona.
Very quickly, Navin Shah.
Thank you. PPE for transport workers is currently a major issue. Transport unions have been very actively lobbying us about their concerns on this matter. Will there be sufficient supply of PPEs available for transport workers? And will this be procured by government, or will it be left to TfL, the Mayor, and bus operators, for example?
Well, TfL's already looking in detail at the issue around PPE. They have followed the scientific guidance at all points. And just to reassure you, the Mayor said that he'll do whatever it takes to keep all transport staff safe, and it's been clear that in the shortages that Andrew Dismore alluded to, that actually health and social care workers had to be first in line for PPE. So TfL is actively looking at this, and should national public health guidance or guidance from the government change about the use of PPE by transport workers, appropriate training in how to make sure that PPE is used appropriately, as well as making sure that the secure supply chains would be needed to ensure it was used safely. And my understanding is, although I would need to sort of clarify this if this isn't the case, that TfL would be responsible for procuring PPE for its own workers.
I just want to say thank you to those Assembly members who sacrificed asking any further questions of Fiona. She needs to go. One last question, Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, Fiona, I know the government's centralised app approach is raising some concerns about the tech, also about how it might be organised. Are you exploring a role within London for strategically coordinating more community-based, low-tech contact tracing and isolation as part of the work that you're doing, as a backup for the government's plan in case it fails?
I think our first instance would be to hope very much that the government didn't launch an app that was going to fail. Contact tracing formed quite a key part of the initial containment phase, and I think that it's the I'll probably say it in the wrong order now, the test, trace and
isolate.
Batch, trace and isolate is going to be a key part of that, and that has to involve the contact tracing to make sure that people are aware of where people are. The app does seem to be a really effective means. I mean, I think a localised, more like if people actually only stayed in their locality, but with a city as large as London, getting an app that works effectively, potentially one that works in a major city as well as on the Isle of Wight, would be really important.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, clearly I think there's a London-wide aspect to this. You wouldn't expect each borough to be doing this. That's why I asked you. Okay, thank you.
Fiona, can we thank you again? We know you've overstayed and you've got other meetings to go to, but can you thank you and the rest of the team for the work they're doing on behalf of Londoners? We've got some more formal items on the agenda, so you may wish to leave us now, but we can't thank you enough. I think we're a little bit more enlightened about some of your work. We're no doubt going to return to this subject in the coming weeks and months as well. But thank you very much for the briefings that you've given to key members of the Assembly over and above than the written ones, and we're very grateful for that. Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, thank you.
Okay, colleagues, if I could then move on. We've just got to take formally, can we ask the committee to note the report and the background to put into questions to the invited guest on COVID-19 and the subsequent discussion that's taken place. I will pick up some of the issues that members have said in future planning for meetings. Finally, can I ask the committee to agree to delegate authority to me, the chair, in consultation with the party group lead members and Caroline Pidgeon, AM MBE, to agree any outputs of today's discussion. Can we agree with that?
Agreed.
The date of the next meeting is, well, the date of the next formal business of the London Assembly is the annual meeting, is due to take place on the 15th of May 2020, and we'll decide which committees are established in 2020/21 Assembly year and a timetable for forthcoming meetings. I'd urge anyone who's watching on this website, on the website, to look out to go into our website and see if there are any further emergency meetings that may well be taking place, or if you are on the mailing list or the email mailing list of the London Assembly, you may well receive calls for meetings. Can I thank everyone for this meeting and participation in this meeting, and thanks again to the team that's allowed us to enable this to happen. I don't believe there's any other business that I consider urgent. I'm now declaring this meeting closed. Thank you very much, Assembly members.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
GLA Chamber Sound.